Imagine waking up one morning and your neighbor is dead. The next day, your baker is gone. By the end of the week, the priest who was supposed to bury them is dead too. This was not a nightmare. This was a Tuesday in 1348. And for millions of ordinary people across Europe, this was simply life. Europe in early 1348 was not a pretty place, but it was alive. It was loud, it was dirty, and it was full of people who had absolutely no idea what was coming for them. Most people back then were peasants. They woke up before sunrise, worked the fields until their backs gave out, ate whatever they could scrape together, and went to sleep exhausted. They paid taxes to lords they never met, prayed to a god they deeply feared, and lived in villages so small that everyone knew everyone else's name, their secrets, and the sound of their cough. The towns were not much better. Streets were narrow and packed. Animals wandered freely. Waste was thrown from windows into the roads below. The smell of a medieval town in 1348 would have knocked a modern person flat on their back. But for the people living there, it was just home. Above the peasants sat the merchants, the craftsmen, the clergy, and the nobility. Each layer of society had its role, its rules, and its certainty that life would continue more or less the way it always had. Famine had come and gone. Wars had been fought. Floods had ruined harvests. But Europe had always recovered. People believed it always would. And then, from somewhere far to the east, something began to move. Something that did not care about social rank, did not respect church walls, and had absolutely no interest in the way things had always been done. It began, as disasters often do, quietly and far away. In the autumn of 1347, a fleet of Genoese trading ships sailed into the port of Messina in Sicily. The people on the dock who came to greet these ships got something they did not expect. Most of the sailors were dead at their oars. The ones who were still alive were covered in strange black swellings, oozing blood and pus from their armpits and groins. They were burning with fever, delirious, barely human. The Sicilian authorities panicked and ordered the ships out of the harbor immediately. But it was already too late. The disease had stepped off the boat and onto European soil, and it had no intention of leaving. Within weeks, it crept into Genoa and Venice. Then it moved west into France, sliding through Marseille like a ghost through an open door. By the time anyone in England heard distant rumors about what was happening on the continent, the plague was already marching steadily toward them. It traveled along trade routes, moving with merchants and rats and fleas, invisible and unstoppable. Every city it touched became a city in mourning. The Black Death had arrived in Europe, and 1348 would become the year the world remembered forever. To understand what people were facing, it is important to understand what this disease actually did to a human body, because it was not simply a fever or an illness that made people feel unwell for a few days. It was something medieval people had never seen before, something so brutal and so fast that many of them genuinely believed the world was ending. The most common form was the bubonic plague. It started with a flea bite, though no one in 1348 knew that. Within days, the lymph nodes would begin to swell into painful, hard lumps called buboes. These could grow to the size of an apple. They appeared under the arms, in the groin, on the neck. The skin around them turned black. The victim's body burned with fever. They would vomit, lose their minds with delirium, and sometimes begin to bleed from places the body should never bleed from. The smell, it was unbearable. People who came near the sick described an odor so foul it seemed to poison the very air around them. And in some cases, that was nearly true. The pneumonic form of the plague attacked the lungs, and it could spread simply through the air when a sick person coughed or breathed near someone else. This version killed even faster, sometimes within 24 hours. A person could feel perfectly healthy in the morning and be dead before midnight. Medieval doctors had no idea what to do. They had no concept of bacteria, no understanding of how infection spread, and no tools that could actually help. Some tried bleeding their patients, cutting them open to let out what they believed were the bad humors inside the body. Others prescribed vinegar baths, or told people to sit in sewers because they thought bad smells could cancel each other out. Some burned herbs and held flowers to their noses, believing that good smells could ward off disease. None of it worked, and deep down, many of the doctors knew it. Some refused to see patients at all. Others fled the cities entirely. The ones who stayed were often dead within weeks. Now here is where the story becomes truly human. Because behind all the historical facts and the death tolls, there were real people living through this. Ordinary men and women who still had to get up every morning, still had to feed their children, still had to somehow make sense of a world that had completely lost its mind. Take a peasant farmer living in a small French village in the summer of 1348. He wakes up at dawn as he always has. He pulls on his rough clothes, steps outside, and immediately notices that his neighbor's door is still closed. He knocks. No answer. He pushes it open. Inside, on the floor, is his neighbor, a man he has known his entire life, dead, with black swellings covering his neck. The farmer does not scream. He closes the door, walks back to his own house, sits down at his table, and stares at the wall. Then, because there is nothing else to do, he picks up his tools and goes to work in the field. Because the crops still need tending. Life still needs to go on. In the town nearby, a merchant is watching his entire world collapse in slow motion. His customers are gone. Half of them are dead. The other half are too afraid to leave their homes. His shelves are full of goods nobody is buying. He walks through the market square one morning and finds it almost completely empty. The stalls that were full of noise and color just 2 months ago are silent. A dog runs through with nobody chasing it. The merchant sits on a stone and tries to calculate how long his savings will last. He stops calculating because the numbers frighten him too much. In the local church, a young priest is drowning. He was trained to comfort the dying, to offer last rites, to send souls peacefully into the next world. But now the dying are arriving faster than he can pray. He moves from house to house, from body to body, reciting the same words over and over until they blur into a sound without meaning. Some nights he digs graves himself because there are no gravediggers left. He begins to wonder privately, a thought that terrifies him, whether God is actually listening at all. And in the manor house on the hill above all of this, a noblewoman has sealed herself inside. She has sent away all servants who showed any signs of illness. She has fresh herbs burning in every room. She eats only food from her own stores. She prays twice as long as she used to. She is certain that her wealth, her status, and her faith will protect her. The plague does not particularly care about any of that. Within a month, 2 of her remaining servants are dead. A week after that, she develops a swelling under her arm. The Black Death did not just kill bodies. It killed the invisible structures that held society together. And that collapse was, in some ways, just as terrifying as the disease itself. People abandon each other. Giovanni Boccaccio, an Italian writer who survived the plague in Florence, wrote that parents abandoned their sick children. Children left their dying parents in empty houses and never looked back. He described it not as cruelty, but as pure survival instinct taking over. When the fear is great enough, even love can break. Servants refused to work. Fields went unharvested because there was no one left to bring in the crops. Entire villages simply emptied out. A traveler walking through the French countryside in late 1348 might pass through 6 or 7 villages and find every single one of them silent. Not quiet, silent. The only sounds were the wind and the crows. The church, which was supposed to be the spiritual backbone of society, began to crack under the pressure. Priests died in enormous numbers. Many fled. Those who stayed sometimes refused to perform last rites because they were too afraid to enter a sick person's home. For medieval people, dying without last rites meant dying in a state of spiritual danger. It meant potentially losing your soul. And the church, which had always promised answers, suddenly had none to offer. In some cities, the breakdown became violent. Jewish communities across Europe were blamed for the plague. The rumors spread that Jews had poisoned the wells. It was completely false, but fear does not require evidence. Entire Jewish communities in Germany, France, and Switzerland were massacred. Thousands of innocent people murdered by their terrified neighbors who needed someone to blame. Meanwhile, a movement was sweeping across Europe that would have seemed completely mad in any other era. Groups of men called flagellants walked from city to city, whipping their own backs bloody in public, believing that punishing their own flesh would satisfy God's anger and stop the dying. Crowds gathered to watch. Some people joined. It was medieval society trying desperately to find a lever to pull, any lever that might make the horror stop. And some people went the other direction entirely. They decided that if the world was ending anyway, there was no point in following any rules at all. They threw open the wine cellars of dead neighbors, held parties in empty mansions, and lived in a way that would have been completely scandalous just a year before. When death is everywhere, some people grieve, and some people dance. In the absence of science, the human mind reaches for explanation wherever it can find one. And in 1348, most people reached for God. The dominant belief was simple and devastating. God was angry. Humanity had sinned, and this was the punishment. Priests preached it from pulpits. Parents told it to their children. It was the only framework that made the scale of the suffering make any sense at all. But the church was not the only institution offering explanations. The medical faculty at the University of Paris published an official report in 1348 blaming the plague on a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars that had occurred in 1345. They believed this alignment had corrupted the air itself, releasing poisonous vapors that caused disease. This was the miasma theory, the idea that bad air was responsible for illness. It was wrong, but it was the most scientific thinking available at the time. What is remarkable, looking back, is how these failed explanations began to chip away at the authority of the institutions that offered them. When the prayers did not stop the dying, people noticed. When the learned doctors fled or died alongside their patients, people noticed that too. The absolute, unquestioned authority of the church would never quite fully recover from 1348. Seeds of doubt were planted in the soil of that terrible year that would not fully bloom for another century and a half. By the time the worst of the plague had passed, somewhere between 30% and 60% of Europe's entire population was dead. In some cities, the number was even higher. Florence lost perhaps half its people. Some regions of France lost 2/3. The continent was quiet in a way it had never been quiet before. But something unexpected happened in the silence. The survivors had power they had never had before. Peasants who had always been told they had no choices suddenly discovered they had many. With so few workers left, landowners desperately needed labor. Peasants could demand better wages, better conditions, and the right to leave if they were not treated fairly. The rigid feudal system, which had kept the poor poor for centuries, began to crack at its foundation. It would not fall overnight. But 1348 had started something that could not be stopped. Art changed completely. Before the plague, religious art in Europe focused on heaven, on saints, on glowing divine light. After 1348, death appeared everywhere. Paintings showed skeletons dancing with kings and peasants alike. The message was clear and newly democratic. Death comes for everyone, regardless of rank. Medicine, humiliated by its complete failure, was eventually forced to ask better questions. The answers would take centuries to arrive. But the plague forced humanity to admit that it did not yet understand the world it was living in. That admission, painful as it was the beginning of something new. The Black Death did not just end. It transformed into the world that came after it. The Renaissance, with its explosion of human creativity and questioning and discovery, grew partly in the scarred soil of 1348. When you have lost everything, when every certainty has been stripped away, some people rebuild what existed before, and some people build something entirely different. Here is what is worth sitting with for a moment. The people of 1348 did not know they were living through history. They did not know that their suffering would reshape civilization. They were just people trying to get through the next day, doing the best they could with what little they understood. Every generation faces its own version of the unthinkable, and every generation, somehow, finds a way to keep moving forward. The world after 1348 was smaller, quieter, and deeply scarred. But it was also, in ways no one expected, more open, more questioning, more human. If this story stayed with you, and it should, drop a comment below with the one fact from this video that genuinely surprised you the most. And if you want to go deeper into the hidden stories of history that most people never get to hear, subscribe right now. Because the next video is going to pull back the curtain on another moment in history that changed everything. And you will not want to miss it. The past is never really over. It is just waiting to be understood.